For all the latest news in North Central Washington, go to ncwlife.com or find us on Facebook. Got a news tip? Email us at news@ncwlife.com or call 888-2020.
So I'm really excited to be sitting here with Cheryl Strayed. She is here from Portland to speak in our community, and everyone is really welcoming you. I'm sure a lot of people watching know your story by now, and in case they don't, you are someone who hiked the Pacific Crest Trail 1,100 miles in 3 months, starting at the Mojave Desert and ending right here in Washington.
Yeah.
Over the bridges. So let's talk a little bit about how, first of all, how you came to want to take that hike, a little bit about your life leading into that.
Right. Well, I began that journey not at the top of my life. I think sometimes we think about, like setting out on a wilderness trek that you're fit and you're feeling great and you're like, let's do something fun. It was actually the opposite of that. I was really in deep grief. My mom had died very suddenly at the age of 45 of cancer. When I was a senior in college. I was 22. And that just completely sent me into an emotional tailspin. I had never imagined my life without my mom. I didn't know how to live without my mom. And of course I was also, a 20-something. I was in this era of my life where I was trying to figure out who I was. And so I made a lot of mistakes, and instead of making my life easier, I made it harder. And there was a certain point a few years after my mom died that I looked up and I thought, I have to gather myself back. I have to find my strength again. And so this hike on the PCT was the idea I had of how to find my way back to myself. I think a lot of people think I escaped my life, and the reverse is true. I wanted to find again who I really was.
So was it a lot difficult to kind of maneuver your life without your mom? So it isn't going out into the wilderness. It's very quiet. It's very alone. You're faced with every single thing you might have been trying to avoid with the other things you were saying that you made mistakes about. So you had never hiked, you said, or you weren't a hiker.
Yeah.
You weren't like a definition of a hiker, and you took off anyway. One of the things I thought about when reading the book and seeing your movie is the bravery it takes to do that. Because
thank you.
I saw the movie before I read the book, so I kept thinking someone on the trail is going to hurt her, or there's going to be a bear. That's bravery in itself. So when you're out there in the middle, my brother would have been someone who would take that hike, not me.
Right.
I know how to stay safe in the city and remove myself from opportunistic crime. But when you're out there and you hear the noises and was that something to adjust to as well?
Well, it's interesting. I actually was a hiker. It was that I had never gone backpacking.
Oh.
I loved to day hike, and I had started by that point really doing day hikes by myself. I'd also grown up in the wilderness of northern Minnesota. So I wasn't afraid of the wilderness. But you're right that, there was still this huge learning curve because I had made this kind of rookie mistake. I sort of thought that backpacking was the same as hiking. And, they're really very different because, of course, with hiking, you're still so attached to, the civilized world.
And where you're getting back to it.
It's most of us, you're going out for an hour or two, maybe all day, but even then, not so often. It was really more just kind of a walk, right? And going backpacking, and this was the big shock for me, is essentially first of all, everything had to be carried on my back, which really alters the experience because it's hard. It's hard to carry everything you need. And then also there's nobody, with every step I took on the PCT, I was going further and further and further away from, anyone else, anyone
if you
who
changed
could.
Your mind,
Exactly.
Take you 3 days
So,
to fix it,
there was that huge sense of venturing into the unknown. And I think that I think this happens to a lot of people is you think, well, I know how to walk, or I've hiked before, but then you find that you are in deeper than you imagined. And that was a really hard experience for me, and also a really educational one.
So at what point in the journey, in this 3-month time, did you start to really feel what you went out there to feel? From the very start, or when did it really start to feel the healing part of what you were looking for?
Right. That's a good question. I think that, it wasn't, I would feel glimmers of it really even from the start, even that first week. So I didn't even encounter another human the first 8 days of my hike. And a lot of what I felt during those first 8 days was a sense of, like, what am I doing here? I've made a big mistake, that this isn't what I expected. I wanted a sort of healing, and instead what it was is this really hard experience that didn't feel at all kind of spiritual. It felt like, where am I going to get water? And I'm hungry and my feet hurt. It was very physical and very practical. But even then, from that very beginning, I think this is also what kept me going, is I recognized that there was something really valuable in those things, that maybe healing looked differently than I thought it looked. Maybe it was, that suffering through that next step, or learning how to, suffer, like really physically, in order to learn how to withstand my emotional suffering.
Well, that you make a good point about how, the healing part of, the losing your mom was part of why you started that journey. But it is, you also mentioned how you didn't know who you were without your mom. And I lost my husband when I was 32, and I remember thinking, I really don't know who I am without this person.
Right.
I don't even know how to maneuver that. And what I find, what I believe is almost the longer someone's gone from our life, the more we get the lesson of their presence. So where is your mom in your life now? Like, how does she still show up for you? In what way?
Well, first of all, I want to say I'm so sorry for your loss. I mean, that's a tremendous relationship, tremendous person to lose in your life. And so I think that you're right. And it's really interesting what you're saying I relate to, and what I wrote in Wild, I know without asking you relate to. And I do think that this is a kind of universal experience of grief, that when you really, truly love somebody in their life, you don't stop loving them in their death. And your relationship with them continues. In some ways it stops. Obviously, your husband's not here anymore. My mom isn't here. We don't get to have those interactions. But what happens with us is we see them in new lights as we change. We have deeper empathy. We ask deeper questions. We have memories that change meaning over time. And, I really do think of it, when you get to that place where you can do that with the beloved person who's no longer with us, that's, in some ways, it's like the most advanced stage of grief, because what that's about is embracing it and saying, my life with my husband ended, but my relationship with him continues. And I think that is a really, it's still sad, it's still hard, it's still not what you would have wanted, and yet it in some ways it gives you the strength to continue on, to find other love, or to and I'm a mom now. I pour back into my kids what my mom gave me. And I don't know that I could have done that as fully if I hadn't come to this understanding of my relationship with my mom continuing.
The other thing that I think that it teaches us, I remember sitting in the lobby or the waiting room of the hospital when he was having his transplants, an 8-hour surgery, sitting there alone, and seeing a pear tree out in front that was blooming. And I remember thinking, being hyper aware of the fact that I knew I had learned, which is a lesson we may never learn, unconditional love. Because nothing he ever did to make me mad mattered. Nothing he ever did to make me frustrated mattered. Just this ongoing feeling that when we get to work out our stuff, whether we go on a big hike or we, however we go about working that out, really all that's left is love.
Yeah.
If we're lucky, right? Then that's kind of the greatest lesson.
That's real love. And I think it's such a great thing for us to remember, right, in our daily lives. Because, you can't be close to someone without them annoying you or making you mad, or, all of those, and those aren't bad feelings to have. I don't think, I actually don't. I think it's a sign of a healthy relationship to feel those things. And yet, what really matters in the end is that essential bond that you have and that love that you share, which is unbreakable, and it's a beautiful truth of life.
Right, and I think too that it is about you know, having that experience young like you did, to lose that significant person, your mom. My mom was very ill last year and survived and is doing very well. But I remember feeling like the ground was pretty shaky.
Yeah.
Because your mom is, you know, that anchor, you hope, in your life. That's what she is, you hope, if you're blessed and fortunate for that. But the other part that I wanted to talk with you about, we'll take a break here and come back to it. I want to talk about sugar. And some people may not know about it as, you know, as widely as your book, Wild. But let's talk about that when we come back.
Have a fun video you'd like to see featured on NCW Life? Email us at newsphotos@ncwlife.com.
We are back. We're talking with Cheryl Strayed. Most of you know her from her book Wild, and it was made into a very successful blockbuster movie, really. Do they call it a blockbuster when it's a beautiful film like that?
Well,
If it does
Academy
all the
Award
yeah,
nominated,
yeah, I know, that's it.
which is pretty amazing.
That is amazing. And we'll get to that because I want to talk to you about that as well. But before the break, we were talking about, I wanted to talk about sugar for those who aren't aware.
Right.
Fill in the viewers.
Okay, well, several years ago, actually, while I was writing Wild, I had just finished the first draft of Wild, I was asked to take over this anonymous advice column called Dear Sugar on a website called The Rumpus. I was asked to take it over because a friend of mine, Steve Allman, was writing it. Nobody was really reading it. The job paid nothing, and I don't mean that metaphorically. I mean zero.
I know.
And I thought, you know, this is kind of fun.
People don't realize how much writers write for free.
I know. Well, the funniest thing for the longest time, I would tell this story and say, you know, the job pays nothing, and people I realized were thinking that I meant like next to nothing.
Yes.
But no, I mean nothing. And you know, so I took it over because I thought this is fun. You know, you get to read about other people's problems and secrets, and they write you letters, and I'll write them letters back. It was really just sort of a lark, and what ended up happening is it became really way up there among the most powerful experiences I've had as a writer and a human. Because what I decided to do is not write the regular advice column. I decided to really give every letter and every answer, everything I could as a writer and a human. And so each of those replies are really essays about what it means to be human. And I write, you know, and I collected them together in this book called Tiny Beautiful Things, which was adapted for the stage last fall in a play starring Nia Vardalos of My Big Fat Greek Wedding fame. And, you know, it was, so this book is a collection, and so many people come to Tiny Beautiful Things via Wild, you know. They loved Wild, they're like, oh, what's this weird Dear Sugar book?
Right.
But then they come to my events and they hold out that Dear Sugar book to me and they say, this is my favorite book of yours. So it's kind of like a, you know, a sort of my sort of sleeper hit. You know, Wild always gets all the, she's the shiny big sister.
Right.
But Tiny Beautiful Things has this big following as well.
Well, I've read so many of those, and what I found so interesting is that, and I read a lot of them online, outside of the book.
Yeah, back in the day.
And that is kind of an interesting way to do it because it was hit and miss, but always it seemed like it's like when you show up at church at the right time and they're speaking right to you. That's the way I'd feel about some of them that I read. And what I found, which is obvious, which I'm sure you would agree with and share, that these responses were just as therapeutic as the questions.
Right.
Because one of the ones that stood out to me was when your dad told you could put as much butter on the popcorn.
Oh,
And so you pull something in from your life, and that's what makes you so relatable, I believe, because you are willing to share, be the storyteller, and involve yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I really believe, you know, when I was trying to think about, like, how do I help people through this advice column? You know, one thing I knew right away is most of us aren't helped by somebody lecturing us and telling us what to do because they know better. You know, we don't usually listen to people who act like they're better than us, you know?
Right.
And so I really thought about, like, what has been helpful to me in my life? And the answer to that is story. It's meeting somebody who says, I've had that experience too. I am sorry, you know, for your loss. I understand what you're saying. Or, you know, stories in literature, in books and essays and poems, where you think, that is me. And of course, with Wild, that's what people say to me all the time. I related so much to what you wrote about, whether that be about the journey of the hike or my grief or the other, my divorce, any of those things I wrote about in Wild. And so for Tiny Beautiful Things, this Dear Sugar column, I just decided I would tell stories from my life in ways that I thought were useful or helpful to the person who was seeking advice. And that allowed me to sort of expand that narrative beyond just the two, the person who wrote me a letter and me. It wasn't just two people in conversation. It includes really all of us. I mean, we don't all have that exact same problem as the letter writer, but we've almost all been in a situation that seems a bit like that in some way. And that's what I was always looking for in my answers, is how to expand the question via my answer.
I watched the interview or the speech that you gave in San Francisco the night
Oh,
that
yeah.
you were killed. It was really beautiful, the way that you explained why you did it, how you did it, and you were talking about your kids and how you can't spread your arms wide enough, that there's not enough words to describe your love for them. And I was thinking about you, because I watched that recently, once I knew you were coming. And my son is now 18, just turned 18, about the time I read that. And he's leaving for college soon. And I have a plan to get out of Dodge for a little bit. I thought I'd build a tiny house and travel, but now I have the reality of college tuition, so building a tiny house isn't really going to happen. But I am going to travel, and I'm going to do what I do with the Don't Wait Project and tell stories and invite people to tell me their stories. And so I think that as a storyteller, which you are, and I feel like I am as well, and on a different level, what is it like when your story becomes Reese Witherspoon's story? I mean, as a writer.
And via Reese Witherspoon.
Is that something that you...
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because it's like, obviously it's thrilling that a movie star played me in a movie and Laura Dern played my mom. All of that stuff is just completely mind-blowing and thrilling and surreal. But I have to say, Reese is just like Oprah, just like you, just like like the millions of people around the world who have read the book and seen themselves in it. And so, it's it was a very exciting, powerful experience to have the book made into a movie. But I have to tell you, in comparison to the thousands of letters I get or emails I get every month, or just people saying thank you, this, by reading your book I did this or that. And that's what I love about the both the power of the book but also the movie, is like that the story reaches beyond me, and it reaches beyond Reese, and it reaches beyond you, and it becomes a kind of it becomes something that doesn't even belong to me anymore, which is so strange, because of course Wild is such a personal story. It really is me and my life and my mom. But then it takes on meaning when other people take it into their hearts, and that's really powerful to me. And then I also got to go to the Oscars and wear a pretty dress. I mean, that was just like the icing on the cake. And to this day, I just still. I can't believe that happened to me. I can't believe that all of this has happened. I mean, I've worked really hard, don't get me wrong. It's not like, but it's also just like, wow, I feel always a sense of gratitude and astonishment, truly.
And then here we are, you're here to talk about it in town. You're in Wenatchee, just briefly. So thank you for taking the time to talk with me. But, and. That's great grammar. But the reality is that people still want to talk about that story.
Oh yeah.
It's been
5 years. It's been out 5 years.
Yeah.
Well, see, that's the awesome thing about a book. I think sometimes we forget this because, a book gets publicity usually just right when it first comes out, and then onward we go. But you can pick up a book that somebody published 200 years ago, and it's relevant to you. And and if it's the first time you read that book, it's the first time you're receiving that story. And so, I was just thinking about this actually this afternoon. It's like, okay, here I am, 5 years out. I have been talking about Wild,
Do you ever get tired of it?
For more than 5 years, because I was talking about it before the book's publication too. And yet, I have to say, every time I've talked about it, I'll stand in front of that audience tonight, and it's going to feel fresh. It's going to feel new, because I don't give the same talk every time. And I actually look out into the audience, and I look at people's faces, and I hear their silence, and I hear their laughter, and I see the tears that come into their eyes, and I respond to that. So it always is like still a kind of living thing.
Who could possibly get tired of that?
Right.
Never get tired of that.
It's well, if you stay engaged,
Right.
it's always engaging.
Right. Exactly.
So yeah.
Well, I'm super grateful you're here, and I look forward to hearing your speech tonight.
Oh, thank you.
So this sort of thing, you're here now, and you've written The Wild, and you've written your Tiny Beautiful Things.
And my first book, Torch.
Yes.
Yes.
And so is writing still something you're doing regularly?
No. Yeah, that's what I do.
Yes.
That's,
Aside
obviously
from all
I'm a
this.
little busy.
Yes.
I have a Dear Sugar Radio podcast. I do talks. But yeah, I'm a writer foremost. And so yeah, I'm working on another book. I don't like to talk about what it is, because it always seems sort of dumb,
Yeah.
but I'll always be working on another book till the day I die.
Right. And did you grow up wanting to be a writer?
Yes.
That was it.
I did.
I got my first Christmas present I got that I remember was a plastic red typewriter.
Oh, really?
And then by about 5 years later, I got one that was metal and had correction tape.
Nice.
Life-changing.
Moving up, right?
Yeah.
Thank you for
Yeah,
taking the time to talk to me.
thanks
This
for
was
having
fun.
me here. I mean, thanks for being here.
I know, I'm like,
getting all,
Thanks
you're
for
wrapping up the interview, and I'm like,
this has been another episode of, yeah.
Well, so thank you for being here. Again, of course, we're talking with Cheryl Strayed. If you haven't read her book, I can't imagine that you haven't at least heard of her book, Wild. That's what she's here to talk about in Wenatchee, and thanks again.
Go out and read it.
Yes, go out and read it.
Stay up to date with what's happening in North Central Washington. Go to the NCW Life community calendar at ncwlife.com.